Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Environments Exposed. I'm so excited for today's guest. We have Dorthy Suskind on, and I found her and her work on psychologytoday.com, and her work around bullying is out of this world. I did a quick internet search. I was looking for a particular topic, and I found she had all sorts of articles about different topics within the bullying realm. It's just fascinating. I think there's so much kind of general advice in the world about bullying, but this really gets into the nitty-gritty. And I'm so excited about today's topic because we're going to be talking about creatives and bullying. So if you're a creative person who's been bullied, either as a child or then as an adult, or if you have children or people that you care about that have been in this situation, I think you're really going to love today's episode. So welcome, Dorothy. I'm so excited to have you. Thank you for joining.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Awesome. Would you like to share a little bit more about what you do so the audience knows? You'll tell it better than I would.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So I am a college professor at Longwood, which is in Farmville, Virginia, where I'm in the education and counseling department. And I primarily teach students who want to be teachers. And then I also teach a capstone course, which I created and I love for all different majors called Women as Disruptive Change Agents. So that is a great, great joy. But also, as college professors, one of our jobs is to do research. And my primary research agenda is I study workplace bullying. I had a traumatic workplace bullying event years ago. And as a researcher and a writer and a teacher, I really just wanted to understand what happened to me. And if you talk to workplace bullying researchers, a lot of them will tell you that same story. We're an interesting bunch. But I primarily, for decades, have been what we call a narrative inquiry researcher. And that really means that when we're trying to understand, like sometimes we'll say a phenomenon, and in this case, that would be workplace bullying, we try to find people that have experienced, in this case, workplace bullying, and just really listen to their story with no agenda, just listen to what they have to say, and then collect those stories, and then look at those stories as a whole, and try to make sense of them using a story format. Like when I think about bullying, who are the characters of that story, and what's the setting, and what's the problem, and what's the conflict, and what are resolutions? And so that's what I've been doing. And I'm in my third year of a large-scale study where I've been collecting stories of bullying victims. And to date, I have over 200 stories from men and women, but primarily women, probably about 90% women, from all over the world. I think I've got 9 different countries, the majority of states within the United States, and representing, I think currently it's about 27 different industries, and of all ages, 18 all the way to, over 70, which is really interesting. And there's just a lot of the things that those stories have in common.
Wow, that's incredible, Dorothy. So I love what you shared about gathering the data and the stories from this. And what's really interesting to me is actually my next question was going to be, how do you begin to explain or define bullying? But I think you basically just told us what it is. It's the collective experiences of people that have experienced something that we all know is a phenomenon, right? But each person's having kind of a slightly different definition or experience of what that is, right?
Absolutely.
What are then, I guess, instead of asking the question of how to explain or define bullying, what are some of the common themes that you've found?
Oh, absolutely. So I'm trying to think the best way to answer that question. It may help. One of the things that I found is that there is a common plot cycle that most bully victims go through. Would that help?
Yeah, like a typical like a timeline. Oh, and this actually goes into another question I was going to ask you. Yeah, this would be great.
And let me ask you, would you let me start with kind of a story that kind of illustrates the timeline, and then I can kind of break it down into like what the cycle looks like? Or tell you
let's go for it. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So this is actually, and I do change names purposely and identifying information, and we do that like as part of our research protocol. So these are not these are pseudonyms, but I'll kind of give you the story of a woman named June. Okay, she worked in a marketing firm, and she'd been there for over 20 years. Like she was like absolutely phenomenal. She was really competent, super innovative thinker. People would always come to her for advice. Like, she was like the go-to person. And she was just really genuine, like not interested in office politics or anything like that. And things were great. Like she was always at the top of her field. And then a new manager came in named Maud, and also a pseudonym. And that was interesting because Maud was younger. She was, fairly, people would describe her as insecure. She was very much like a top-down leader, and she would get the job done instead of talking really direct to people, kind of like through the grapevine and kind of backroom deals. A lot of people described her as having like a loose affiliation with the truth. And the first thing she recognized, June, was just a powerhouse. And so what she did is Maud kind of cozy up to June and tried to become her friend. And sometimes Maud would be like, I just feel really close to you, June. I've never told anyone this, but I want to share this, and pretended to really open up to June. And that's one of the things that we see with bullies. And kind of in response, when someone opens up to you, then you often will open up to them and kind of be more vulnerable. And that is really what June did. She started to talk about her family. She talked about her love of writing and how she used writing as a creative means and the role writing had in her creative process. And that's kind of how it went on, probably for about 6 months. And then one day, June introduced kind of this like really innovative idea at work, and everyone was really excited about it. But it was a proposal that would really invite the department to kind of restructure and do some things differently. So it was really like shaking up the status quo. And this was not the cause of the bullying, but kind of Maud used that moment, like sometimes we'll call it like a precipitating event, to start to like stir unrest. So in response, Maud like started to have like an underground battle, like kind of launch a battle. And so when like Maud was at lunch with people that worked for her or bosses, she would just kind of start to drop these things about June. Like June's not a team player. June wants to be in charge. If these ideas go through with June's, we are all going to be in great big trouble. And at this point, June has no idea any of this is going on, which is usually the victim's experience. And then Maud did something else that bullies almost always do, is that she went to human resources and said, I really like June, but I'm just worried about her. She seems overwhelmed and she can't handle this. And I'm scared that she's talking about things that she doesn't know about. And so I'm just here because I care, in like air quotes. And then Maud did another thing that's fairly common, is Maud reached out to her boss and gave kind of that same message. So at this point, like Maud is starting to kind of create a narrative without June knowing, right? And then about a month later, Maud returned back to HR and just said, you know what? I'm still really worried about June. And since this has been going on for a month, I think we need to put her on a performance improvement plan, or a PIP. And like, this is a woman, June's a woman that's been working at this place for years, actually decades, and it's phenomenon. It's phenomenal. And so then at this point, she also starts to kind of do things to June, but kind of indirectly. So Maud will forget to invite June to meetings, or Maud will like not invite her to social events, or tell her kind of like the wrong location. So June goes to the wrong place for after work, drinks or something like that. And then Maud starts to purposely, really like what you would call like interview colleagues, to say, what do you think about June, and just so you know, like June's having some problems, and you might want to kind of separate yourself from her because I don't think you want to be aligning with her. And then the next thing, June is starting to realize that things like something is wrong. And at this point, the thing that is happening to June is it's not just her work that is being attacked. She's really being painted as someone that is incompetent, not good at her job, that all her past successes are just a farce, right? Like they were just a mistake. People just gave her too much credit. And that in order for like the company to be safe and for people not to lose their jobs, it's really important that they just get rid of June. So that's kind of the next step. And at this point, June starts to have a lot of health consequences. Like she's getting migraines when she goes to the doctor just for like her yearly checkup. The doctor's like, wow, like your blood pressure has gone through the roof. And now that June is back in the office, she has all these demands on her that are almost impossible to meet. So Maud has implemented this PIP or performance improvement plan. But while June is trying to meet her goals, like the resources that she needs are being withdrawn. So like the computer programs that she needs, the art software that she needs, like just disappears. And then her colleagues that she used to really rely on will no longer collaborate with her. And some of the work that she does do just disappears. And June is a wise woman. Like she is keeping a journal of all of this. And she said, oh, you know what? I don't want to do this, but I'm going to go to human resources and complain about Maud. And when June does that, human resources, of course, has already kind of been conditioned to believe that something else is going on. So they just kind of ignore her and just say, Maud's your boss. She has your best interest at heart. So June goes back, continues to keep working, but it gets worse and worse. So she goes back to HR again. She presents like all this documentation, all of her notes. And at this point, HR gets scared about a lawsuit. And so they do something that we see a lot in the literature is that they offer her a small severance if she is to leave. But in return for that severance, they're going to ask her to sign an NDA or a non-disclosure agreement. And think that June is completely just torn apart, that this career that she's built is falling apart, and that colleagues that she loved and trusted are isolating her. And so she signs it. And then she's left without a job. She's left with a very small severance package, which isn't enough to sustain her very long, and with a lot of fairly significant health consequences and no insurance. And that's just kind of one example of the bullying process. But that cycle, and I can kind of summarize the cycle, like the different steps, I see against most of the case studies that I've collected.
Yeah. That is really interesting. So for folks listening to this or watching our video here, think to yourself, because I was really engaged in this story, how many points in this story could you personally relate to, right? I noticed something. I was making a list of all the things that I'm like, yep, I've seen this or I've experienced this, in my personal life or life of clients or friends or people I care about. And it's always like the same story. You've got someone who's a high performer, who's got talent, if you want to call it that, genuine and sincere, is not concerned with, the inner workings of office politics, like you said. They just come across the person who's got like an agenda, who is maybe, not operating in an honest way, right? They may go and like you said, explore these routes to kind of circumvent things. You've got people planting the seeds of doubt, right? She planted the seeds of doubt with, all of her office colleagues, And she even escalated it, right, to HR and these performance reviews. So really, you just have a creative person doing their thing who comes across a person, who's maybe disempowered and has an agenda, right? So, but I noticed all these different, and which is interesting to me too, Dorothy. When you started to get into this, these piece about stirring unrest, right? Escalating things, the sabotage, the deleting of work, the exclusion from emails and events, the kind of passive aggressive behavior, the undermining, the trying to ruin someone's reputation. This is stuff that comes up. I just, again, so many common themes across bullying in general. And what really came up for me, and I know this is a whole separate topic, so I don't want to go like deep here, but in my experience and from what I've seen, that's what happens in retaliation, often with sexual harassment and harassment in the workplace as well. So there's some overlap there too, which I noticed was really interesting. So that's kind of again, to anyone listening, how many times did you raise your hand to yourself and think, oh my gosh, I've seen this or I've experienced this? There are a lot of common themes, and this timeline that you provided, Dorothy, I think is really helpful because, again, it's what happens, I think, every time to a talented person, who find themselves, unfortunately, sometimes interacting with the wrong type of person on the other end. Right?
Absolutely, 100%. And I'll say one of the things that there's so many things where so many ways that victims can start to feel a little bit of kind of comfort and start to heal. But one of the first ways, and I also think this is a really important part when we talk about prevention, is just really understanding the cycle. And so, kind of what I just talked about, there are different researchers that have laid out the cycle or the steps or the phases, whatever you would like to call it. But they all are fairly similar. And I usually think about like in 6 stages. Like first, there is a target identification. And usually the target is just like you said. It is someone that's a high performer, someone that is competent, someone that others may be kind of threatened or jealous about. Sometimes it's also somebody that has kind of recalibrated the status quo, and so the expectations become higher. And it can also be someone that whistleblows on unethical or illegal behavior. And then kind of the first thing that happens is that bully kind of gets jealous and does these underground battle plans. And at that point, the victim usually has no idea about what's going on. And then there's like a precipitating event. And the precipitating event is not the cause of the bullying, but it's just really the event used to kind of kick off the campaign against him or her. So in June's case, it was that she came up with an innovative idea. It could have been a number of things. And then the bully really starts that underground battle. And we see the themes in the literature is belittling and gossiping and rumors and ostracization and exclusion and sabotage. And then things really start to escalate. And usually bullying is not between two people. More often than not, it turns into mobbing. And mobbing is more of a term that the Europeans use. But I would say the majority of bullying eventually turns into mobbing. So at that point, the bully has really recruited all of these different people to kind of join in on the attacks. And then often the victim eventually loses her job, not always, but unfortunately more often than not. And then there's just a lot of kind of cover-ups at the company, and a lot of times that takes the form of a non-disclosure agreement. There are a lot of organizations like Lift Our Voices has done a great job of pushing back on non-disclosure agreements in issues of sexual harassment, but slowly kind of extending that to people that have been bullied. So the stories are not told, because certainly non-disclosure agreements make sense to protect trade secrets, but they're not intended to cover up or perpetuate bad behavior.
Yeah, if I had a nickel for every time someone told me that they had to, or I've seen or witnessed signing an NDA because the company's trying to cover their ass, basically. And that, like you said, that's not what they were originally meant for. So, very interesting. I love the term that you mentioned, mobbing, because, this has definitely been, I've had this experience as well, professionally and growing up. I think that's a huge part of bullying. I think the bully knows that there's power in numbers. So they plant those seeds of doubt, and they just know that it spreads and it grows itself, right? And so if there was any level of doubt or uncertainty in other people, it just kind of grows and grows and grows until that person's reputation is demolished, right? Because of this one person who had an agenda. And I also love what you said about the precipitating event. I was counting the number of times and like the experiences I had personally too with precipitating event. Have you ever, and I just want to say to anyone listening to this, have you ever had an experience, again, you're likely a creative, sensitive, and female or feminine leaning person, right? Have you ever had an experience where you were bullied and the precipitating event just made no sense to you whatsoever? You're like, how could they be so mad at me over XYZ? It's not because it was actually well, I can't speak for that exactly, but it may not be because you actually did something like terrible that deserved all this negative attention. In fact, I think it's probably almost never the case. I think that it's literally just they were looking for that thing that they could pick on you for. They were looking for an excuse to drag you, basically. And so oftentimes it's something that seems kind of maybe minor or just kind of like, why did they do that? It's because they were looking for something and then they just built upon it and made it like made the mountain out of the molehill, so to speak. So I thought those were really good points that you made, because that's, again, I think many of us have had that experience. And that can be pretty, the mobbing can be really traumatic. I know, Dorothy, you were saying earlier you had a experience or maybe experiences where you've experienced workplace bullying and how traumatic that can be. I think when we have one person who we're not getting along with, that's one thing, and that maybe doesn't feel good. But when you have an entire group of people that have decided to buy into the narrative, as you called it, it can really damage one's self-esteem, right? And so that's, I think that's a pretty key point. And so I would love to actually ask you about that. What are some things that people who've experienced bullying, especially this mobbing effect, and especially creatives, and we do tend to be so sensitive and so sincere, and we don't necessarily understand the motives of other people who have done things like this. What do you recommend as far as nurturing oneself and getting back to a place of, I guess, like personal power or confidence for people who've experienced this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Before I answer that, because I think it will help kind of inform that answer, can I talk a little bit like about a degradation ceremony?
Okay. Yes.
It makes sense.
Okay.
This is what I think does the damage, because so often people will be like, why are you so upset because some guy or some woman at work is being mean to you? And that's really not it at all. I think it's important for people to understand like what's really going on. So I think, first of all, when we think about people that are really impacted by bullying, like a couple things, especially with creatives, we see is that they have something like what we call as researchers sometimes as like a high core self-evaluation. And that's just the sense of having a strong sense of who we are and what our values are and what we want to do in the world. So we have a pretty strong sense of self. And then there is a psychologist named Ronnie, I think it's Janoff Bullman. And in the 90s, she talked about, she wrote a book. It's really good if people ever wanted to read it, called Shattered Assumptions. And she was not speaking specifically about bullying, but I think it relates with this idea that as kind of creatives and empathic people, we have these core assumptions that the world is good, that the people are good, and that things kind of happen for a reason. And, when you work hard, you are going to accomplish great things. And also this belief that we are good people, like we're doing good work in the world. And when something really traumatic happens, hence the name of her book, Shattered Assumptions, it really shatters our sense of self. And that is really devastating for people that have a strong sense of who they are. And then go through, which I think is probably one of the best explanations of workplace bullying. And I'm going to call it a degradation ceremony. So I did not make up that term. There was a sociologist in the mid 50s named Harold Garfinkel. And he was the one that kind of laid this out. He wasn't talking about bullying, but I think it really is kind of what happens. And basically, it's like you have a group of people, and it could be like a group of teachers or a group of nurses or doctors or just a group of people at work, and they have a pretty kind of narrow and tight sense of group norms. Like, this is how we act, this is what we say, this is how long we work, these are the people that are acceptable to talk to, and these are the people we don't talk to. And then you'll have this person that comes in, and this is usually the creative that breaks those group norms. It might be because she's really productive, she's really innovative, so she's not just going to do and think like everyone else is doing, or she could be calling out bad behavior. And in response to that, this tight group kind of launches an attack. That's kind of like the first missile to try to bring that person back into compliance. And so that could be done. They try basically enforcing group norms, like through gossip, manipulation, and all of those things. And if that doesn't work, which it usually doesn't, then the next thing is that we are going to ostracize that person. The group is going to ostracize her. And what's important is they don't ostracize her, which you kind of saw in the case of June, by saying, you know what, I don't think June is competent at creating the ad that we're currently working on. Instead, they really attack her character. Like, she's not a good person. She cannot be trusted. She's a danger to the organization. It is a mistake that she is here. And in order to protect this hospital, this school, this marketing firm, the only thing we can do is to get rid of her. And then there is this mobbing, and this person is eventually pushed out. And that, I think, is where the deep harm comes from, because to be pushed out of a community or to be like othered or unbelong is one of the most traumatic things people can go through. And we know from the research that it's pretty typical when somebody gets pushed out, there is usually an inside campaign that continues of, you are no longer allowed to talk to that person, even if you're best friends. So this person is out of the job, and she's like, wait a minute, like, this girl or this man was like, we were buddies. We did research together. We wrote together. We went to lunch every day. And now she won't return my text. So that is just so deeply, that's the part that I think is so debilitating. Not the bullying, but to have someone, sometimes I'll say like that just basically hijacks your narrative, like changes your story.
Yeah. That's those are some really interesting points, and I noticed a few of them are actually from your article around creatives bullying. So thanks for including some of the qualities that creatives like, why they're a target, right? Why would a creative person who's just doing their thing be a target? Well, because creative people are disruptors, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, usually they have a strong sense of self, and there are these whatchamacallit. They're changing the status quo. They may have some sincerity. They may have, some honesty, some levels of honesty that others do not. As you were talking, I was reflecting again on experiences that I've had. I've had experiences, pre-trauma work that I guess you would say were really, like, just felt really debilitating, right? I think a lot of us have. where you've been othered because you had a different viewpoint, because people, again, you had that one person that created a narrative and just let it spread like wildfire, which, I think if bullies knew how harmful what they were doing would they care? Would they change? I don't know. That's a kind of interesting question that I just thought of. But for those of us, and we can speculate about that all day, right? But for those of us who've experienced it, or we have people, loved ones that have experienced it, etc., these are really good points, right? These are really good points. We may show up to a situation, and I say the word naive, but I don't mean that in a mean way. I think, and again, you said this in one of your I love it. She's trying to get my attention. Mommy's busy. So we talked about how people show up to spaces and they have this kind of way of seeing things where they kind of see the best in people, right? They have this maybe projection of the world that's like, oh, I see the best in this. And those are really great qualities to have. You seeing the magic in another person is a really beautiful quality to have. I think where creatives, where we often get ourselves into trouble, and raise his hand, I've been there too. We see the best in people when we can keep that, but we also need to see them, I think, in their three-dimensional sense, who they really are when they're insecure or when they're triggered or when this or when that, because that's the reality of what we're dealing with when we're dealing with bullies. Now, bullies are people too, but they may have a lot of insecurities. They may have insecurities so big. The way I think about it is this, and I don't know if this resonates with you, Dorothy. But my sense is that the bully in this situation has such a level of insecurity that they feel like they have to completely ruin another person in order to feel okay. That's not normal. That's not normal at all. But to completely try to destroy someone's character, someone must have to feel incredibly terrible about themselves in order to do something like that. Which doesn't excuse it, but I think it's a really interesting perspective because, it really just, again, for those of us who want to see the best in people, well, there is like the best 5-dimensional sense of a person, who they are when they're love, when they're this, when they're that, but then there's also this 3-dimensional side of like, ooh, this is what this person is like when they are triggered, and they're triggered a lot, right? So I think that's important to know.
And I think what you said too was really important about the targeting of creatives. I think often comes from creative curiosity. I know I'm someone that asks a lot of questions. So, that's interesting that we do it that way. Tell me about that. And that's not to mean that this is the bad way to do it. I just want to understand. Or like, have we thought about doing it this way? And questions and curiosity, I think, can be threatening to some people and make folks really, really nervous. And I think another thing that we do as creatives is I like to kind of interact with all kinds of different people. So when I'm trying to understand something, I could be reaching out to people from different departments, and I'm not particularly concerned if they are, an entry-level employee or if they're the president. Like, I'm just going to go talk to different people. And I think someone that, if you have an organization that's very hierarchical and you have someone that is kind of perceived as breaking that hierarchy and who she communicates with, that can be really threatening. And two, just kind of talking across departments when there's this emphasis on keeping like really closed circles. And you're like, but no, I want to talk to the engineers and I want to talk to accounting and I want to understand this from different perspectives, which I think as creatives, we do a really good job of. Like, we want to see the world through all these different lenses.
Absolutely. We're natural collaborators. So if you're going to tell me I can't talk to so-and-so, I'm going to be like, okay.
Yeah.
Or I'm like, how can I manage that? Because I really need to talk to this person about this, or I'm really curious about this. So how do you manage that? Right. So there's that. This is how we do things. And maybe that's correct, or maybe it isn't. Creatives don't really care. We're looking to get the answer. We're looking to get to the bottom of something, I think. And there's that curiosity. And for me, what really came up for as you were talking about this is like we really want to be value adds, right? We really want to be contributors, right? So we're asking and we're curious and we want to see like where can is there a gap and where can I fill that? So that's really I think important to this conversation as well. Is like we are natural collaborators, and I think a lot of these environments that we find ourselves in aren't necessarily conducive to that. It's like, oh, you're not allowed to talk to this person, okay? It can stifle a little bit.
Absolutely. And then I didn't answer your original question.
Oh, that's okay. We'll get to that. Yeah. Good.
But as far as like how to solve it, and that is such a hard thing. There's so many different kind of avenues. I think first, more just like on the big picture, global, existential, is an understanding that usually bullying is not about a person, that it's cultural. Most bullying happens in organizations that have toxic cultures. So that's important, number one. Number two, just kind of as a precursor, and especially for women that are just entering the workforce, some of the best career advice I got when I was like in my early 20s was, create a vita or a resume that you can go anywhere. So just always like create a life where you are really marketable. So if you need to leave a place, you have like lots of options, because there's so much power in knowing that you have options. And the other piece, which is very kind of sad to think about, but when bullying starts to happen, is to start to think like, what happens if I need to leave, and start thinking about that, because some of us can leave right away, but other people, for a lot of different reasons, financial, as far as where they are in their job track, need to stick around for a while, but kind of start to think like, what might an exit plan be? Because often that's where you end up. Some other things that I found really helpful is to ask better questions. Like, as women, I think that we can be pleasers. I know that I certainly can. So instead of like me asking like, how can I get my boss to like me, and why doesn't she value my work, and what's going on with these colleagues, like why don't they like me, can I be nicer, can I work harder, what can I do? And not that those aren't valuable questions, because of course they are, but I think a shift can really happen when you can like look inside and say, okay, like what is the type of work that I want to do in this world? Like, how do I want to show up? What do I want to contribute? Like on a big picture. And then where I am right now, like, is this an organization that matches my value structure and that I can do that work? And if it's not, where is a place that might be possible? So I think kind of transitioning to ask different questions is just helpful. Like, I sometimes with my students, I'm like, you just got to put on different lenses. You got to look at the world in a new way. And then kind of like some really just practical things. I think some mental health. I'm a writer by trade, but I also just write. If you could see my bookshelf, I have just my
books. Yeah.
Lots of books and like 40 journals from many decades. But I think there's a lot of power in journaling each night about what's going on with your experience. Like, you need to document bullying, but also it's just a way to kind of pour your story on the page. And because bullying so often hijacks your narrative, it's a way to kind of take your story back. And then I'm sure you know about Julia Cameron has like morning pages where you just, her idea is that you just pour your heart out in the morning, and she would suggest that you then throw it away. I don't throw my writing away, but I can certainly see how that would be cathartic. And then also when you write, kind of like Brene Brown would talk about, what is the story I'm telling myself? Or Anne Lamott would say, having shitty first drafts. But I go back and look what I wrote and say, okay, what is the story I'm telling myself? Is that true? Like, am I really unsuccessful? Let me think about all the things I've done. No, I don't think that's true. So starting to kind of challenge that narrative. And then some things that seem to be helpful in the workplace. I'm very bold in my thoughts and raising my hand to share my opinion, but I'm not confrontational. Like, when someone comes at me, I'm usually like, whoa, I don't want to get in a fight with you by any means, but just some simple things that research supports and I think are helpful. When somebody, a coworker or a boss, says something to you that's hurtful, or you're just like, whoa, what's going on, is to have this dramatic pause. There's something about just going, huh, and just looking at them and saying nothing, maybe taking a sip of water. It allows you to separate for a minute, and it allows them to be like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have said that. And then also sometimes if you're feeling bold, is to clarify. So when someone says something like, I am not able to do my job because you never turn your work in, just say, I'd like to clarify what you're saying. Are you saying that you are struggling with your success at the job because of me? Just ask some questions in a polite way, but just to perhaps clarify. And another thing that I find that can be really helpful is to try not to make it too personal. So instead of saying, it is troubling to me when you do this, I try not to use me. I'll just say, it is surprising that you would. Like, just give yourself a little bit of, I think it's a way to take your power back. And then also, I think it's okay sometimes to say, all right, thank you for that feedback. Let's move forward. Like, just not to get too caught up into it. And something I use a lot is when I hear people gossiping about somebody, and they'll kind of turn to me, and I'm just really truthful, and I'll say, that's not my experience with her. I think just saying that that's not my experience is a good way to not kind of get caught up in that gossiping, and also kind of set an example of, we're not going to talk about people here, because that's just not how I want to show up in the world.
Yeah. Dorothy, I wanted to share with you, because I think this circles back to what you were sharing earlier about what's some of the, and again, for those of you listening, there's like a really good bulleted list of different qualities and creatives that can sometimes, unfortunately, make us targets for this. Some of our greatest gifts, unfortunately, are seen as a threat to these bullies, right? But what you're outlining is actually, how do we use these strengths? I'm seeing a number of creative strengths here you actually use in combating the bullies, right? How can we use our strengths to actually combat this nonsense? And so some of these that you were mentioning, this knowing when to kind of, cut off the conversation, or, saying, I had a different experience, or I remember this person differently, right? I think is really a powerful trait of that disruptor, right? So that person who's not afraid to kind of look at things differently. So that's that creative quality, and you can use it in this way. So I think that's really wonderful. I also love what you said about clarifying, and this is a strategy I love as well. It definitely tends to kind of, I think it has a tendency to kind of like bring the conversation notches a few down if someone's acting kind of negatively. But again, that curiosity, like you'd mentioned before, that's a trait of creative people. So using that curiosity in this way can be helpful as well. And then I think something that we all do, whether we're writers or we put, paint to canvas or whatever kind of creativity we are, there's always some level of, I'm going to call it a brain dump. I don't love that term, but I need to like find another way to refer to it. But the brain dump that we all do when we're trying to get information out.
Right.
One thing that I've really found is helpful, and again, like you said earlier, there's documentation, but what's often valuable for me is if you ever had a bullying experience, or experience where you kind of thought your experience was not necessarily, like, it was undermined, like you would share it with a friend, or you'd share it with a loved one, and they wouldn't really get it. If you actually brain dump everything that's happened with a bully, and you see it on paper, it makes it real, and you're like, oh my God, like, I'm not losing myself here. Like, this actually happened. This is the reality of it. And this is, I think it really grounds you in what happened. And, again, not to kind of victimize ourselves, but like how terrible it was. So you can really just understand, like, yeah, no, this is real. This really happened. I'm not going to gaslight myself over it. Right. And I think it helps us to start feel through those feelings as well. Which is important. One thing you said that I loved, so you're talking about job descriptions, and for those women and those feminine identifying people that are entering the workforce or early on, looking at job descriptions. So what I would love to recommend, and I don't know if if you agree with this or not, but you know how we always have lawyers review legal documents? Could we have our psychologists review our job descriptions?
That's a really good idea.
Because there are key terms that I keep seeing people say, like, probably want to avoid a company that has this verbiage or this verbiage or this verbiage is sensitive, because they're just going to run over you like a steamroller, right? There's those are key telltale like phrases that certain companies use when they end up being maybe kind of a toxic company, and a psychologist will probably look at that and say, oh, you might want to think about that one, or you might want to ask some questions about this in your interview, right? So I just had that thought as you were talking about that, and I was like, good idea. So asking better questions, again, goes back to that curiosity. As someone who's experienced a lot of trauma, and to be completely transparent, this has been like a long journey of mine, and I've healed a lot of trauma, but I'm still like in the midst of a very deep dive right now. And so as someone who's experienced a lot of trauma, I can tell you this, what you're saying earlier about kind of planning an exit, I was like, yes. There is nothing more relaxing and feeling safe. And, again, raise your hand to yourself if you're listening or watching this and thinking like, oh, safety has been an issue for you, feeling safe, emotionally safe. Planning an exit can be such a relief in any kind of situation where you're anticipating that you might be re-traumatized by something. Having that kind of preparatory, outline can be really helpful. It can really be a lot more relaxing, because what happens, oftentimes I've experienced for myself a traumatic situation is that it really just like surprises the crap out of you. And so if you can say, okay, you know what, I'm sensing something is off here. I'm not sure what's going to happen, but if such and such happens, I have this, and this going on. Like I have this plan, I have this exit strategy. Like I feel okay. Like no matter what, I know I'm going to be okay. And so that I think is really important. It can be such a relief to just have that exit strategy. For someone who's experienced trauma, I can just tell you that really, really helps. And that goes back to, I think, what you said about, having a resume that can take you multiple places, right? It's that old, I don't know, proverb or whatever it is, not putting all your eggs in one basket. And I agree with that 100%. And I think this, especially for these incoming, newer generations in the workforce, I mean, they're all about, cryptocurrency. And I'm thinking like, multiple streams of income is something that I'm creating for myself. And that's another thing that I think creates a lot of relief for people, because, again, it's not necessarily an exit strategy. I think we want to use things like multiple streams of income, or really quality resumes, to be able to set ourselves up for success. But it also doubles as that, oh, if something happens, I can lean on this, right? So to have that multiple support structure, I think is really, really a really good idea. So just wanted to mention that.
No, I think you're 100% right. And two, we know that when bullying gets really bad, that people do have, issues with their heart, and migraines and gastro issues, and things can get really, really tough. So to try to get out before you are in that space, we see a lot of bullying victims that are diagnosed with PTSD or complex PTSD. It makes a big difference. And I think earlier when you were saying, can we have a counselor or psychologist look at the job description, I would say too, like, if possible, early on, if you can get in with a counselor, I kind of see two people. First, a therapist, counselor, or social worker that can help you kind of work through the initial trauma. And I would say just to make sure that it's someone that has a fair amount of experience with bullying, because there are times when I've collected stories from people who went to a counselor who was very well-meaning, but kind of discredited their story. So someone that kind of understands what workplace bullying is, and then slowly, as you kind of come out of it, to perhaps the counselor can continue on in that role, or to see a coach that can kind of look forward. Like, coaches aren't meant for trauma, but to look forward, like, okay, like what are my next steps? And I think too, what you were saying about trauma, we know that when we're in trauma, like, our body and our brain tends to remember it through our senses and not chronologically. And so part of that writing is you start to, like, create a timeline for your story, and that can be really reassuring too. And not that suing an organization is the right move, but if at some point you were to take legal action, for you to have a very well documented story, that makes a really big difference, because it's going to be hard to just remember things after the fact.
Absolutely. The documentation is key. I'll say one of the best pieces of advice I ever got. I was working at a store years ago. This lady named Cheryl, oh, bless Cheryl, she's so nice. She was like, generations ahead of me, and just knew the world. And one of her biggest pieces of advice was cover your ass at all costs. I was like, okay, that was kind of an intense piece of advice, but you know what? She was right. Because I've had experiences where, unfortunately, you don't realize this necessarily earlier on or before it happens, but sometimes, you do end up having to document a situation. You don't want to have to do it. And it's like, oh my gosh. But you'll thank yourself later when you have things documented, if you ever have to go through something like that. So
100%. And I think the other thing that you said, as far as, like, looking at job descriptions, there is a fair amount of research. And in my study, I asked people to tell of a story a time they were bullied, and then to tell of a story that they felt like they could be their best creative selves. I worded it a little bit differently. And some of the things that came out of that study, but also just the literature in general, is that there are different cultural norms, that cultures that tend to have bullying, sometimes we'll call it, like, have armored leadership, where there's kind of a lack of transparency, and there is a big focus on criticism instead of thinking about how different people contribute, and that everyone in the company, or many people, feel like they're constantly having to kind of, like, hustle for their worth. And there is this propensity to blame, like, kind of to blame and shame people. And it really creates this kind of culture of fear. And so employees, instead of doing what we want to do as creatives, is, like, stand out and do something amazing for the good of the cause, people start to just kind of disappear and hold back, because nobody wants to be seen, and they're scared to get in trouble, and they stop collaborating. And those are pretty well documented. And then, in contrast, in my own study, and certainly other creativity studies, we know that cultures that, like, really nurture people's creative spirits are really autonomous. So people have a lot of control over the work they do, and they're encouraged, like, not to have necessarily this very, like, specific and narrow role, but they're encouraged to kind of work outside their specialty and collaborate with all kinds of different people. And there's this sense of, don't just, like, reinvent, don't keep doing something that we've done forever, like, create something new. And if something's not working, let's, like, look at it and try to problem solve. And there's a focus on professional development, and it's very instead of just productivity, it's very, like, purpose driven, like authentic purpose driven. So often it's hard to get that from just looking at a website, but when possible, there's certainly places you can look in the web where there's kind of off-label reviews of organizations. But if you have an opportunity to talk to somebody that's worked there, that's really helpful.
Yeah, do your research, right? And because they're going to obviously in their interview present the best face that they possibly can. It may not be. I'll tell you a quick story. I don't want to run too much over time, but I worked at a place once where I ended up working there. It was the most toxic work environment I've ever witnessed, and people dropped like flies because of it. They hated it there, and I was not the only one. The guy that I interviewed with, who's no longer there either because they managed him out because he was terrible. But anyway, he gave me a tour of the entire site, but did not give me a tour of the workplace that I would be sitting in itself. That should have been a huge red flag for me. And I just wasn't aware at the time that I should have been paying attention to things like that. But the work environment itself was like everyone sat at a desk, everyone was really close together, it was very loud. And that alone was really not conducive to good work. So the more you can pay attention, ask good questions, not, ignore your intuition, right? When these sorts of questions or like concerns come up, I think is really key. So thanks for bringing that up. I think that holistic approach, like do your research, don't be afraid to look people up because, again, they're going to be presenting the best face they can on those interviews. So anyway, this is such a lovely interview, Dorothy, and I'm sorry that I don't want to run too long. I don't know what you have going on next, but I did want to give you an opportunity to share any offerings you'd like to share with our audience. I've just loved this conversation, by the way. Thank you for being on. So.
Oh, you are very kind. Oh, goodness. Well, I do write for Psychology Today. I have quite a few, a number. I think close to 20.
You got to go check out Psychology Today, folks. Really, she's got a lot of good stuff on bullying there. Very fascinating.
And then I have a website called bullywise.com, and there's actually a link to it on Psychology Today. And that has information kind of about workplace bullying. And if anyone is interested in participating in sharing their story, there's a link to do that. And of course, as researchers, we follow IRB protocol. And my protocol is, I do not share names or companies or anything like that. So that would be fabulous. And I've got a book coming out. My manuscript is due at the end of the summer, so I've got a little bit more time. So that's in the future, but hopefully not in the too distant future.
Congrats in advance on the new book. I can't wait to see it.
Thank you so much. But also, if there's questions or thoughts, I love it. I probably get 5 or 6 emails just a week from people that are reaching out for various reasons, and I really enjoy that. And I also do coaching for people that have been through a bullying experience. I don't have as much time as I wish during the school year because I'm teaching, but I try to take on as many people as I can. But I'm also just happy to help people through email if there's something I can do.
That's wonderful, Dorothy. Thank you for sharing. So in the script for this episode, we'll include her email, the links, and go check her out, guys. She's awesome.
And then one other thing I forgot to mention is that the International Association of Workplace Bullying and Harassment conference is going to be coming up. I'm so excited, in San Diego, hot dog, September 20th through 24th, and there'll be a lot of researchers there, but there's certainly an encouragement for anybody to come that's just interested in workplace bullying or who have been victims of workplace bullying. And one of the really exciting things is this is the first time in history that the conference is in the United States. The United States is a bit behind when it comes to protective legislation, so it's a really, really big deal. And also the National Workplace Bullying Coalition, I'm on the board there, and the research team here in the States is another really good place to look for support.
Very cool. So you'll be there, and I might be there too because I'm going to be looking it up. It's in San Diego. I mean, my goodness.
Absolutely.
It's going to be a fabulous event as well. So, yeah. All right. Well, thank you for sharing with us, Dorothy. This is a fabulous conversation. I'd love to invite you back sometime if you're open to it. It's just wonderful. So, thanks for all you do, and thanks to everyone who's been listening today. Catch you next time.
Thank you.